Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Prince of Persia games were a huge part of Ubisoft's history.
There is something very odd about you.
She has no idea.
Even before Ubisoft acquired this IP in 2001, these games were well known as great side-scrolling action adventures. When Ubisoft acquired the IP, they rebooted the series with Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, a fully 3D action adventure. There was an attempt to create a 3D Prince of Persia game before this, but that game wasn't received with open arms, to say the least. The Sands of Time was a chance for a new beginning.
I give you the Sands of Time.
I never played this game before I started working on this video. The only Prince of Persia game from the original trilogy that I played before was The Two Thrones, and recently I just tried out The Lost Crown. I also played some old Prince of Persia games back in the day, but we're only going to cover these 7 games from Ubisoft in this video. So I almost went completely blind into 80% of these games. It's going to be a wild ride, so sit back, grab some drinks, and let me tell you about my experience with Prince of Persia games.
Hi.
Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time came out in 2003 on PC and pretty much all 6th generation of consoles. This is the first Prince of Persia game developed and published by Ubisoft. I never played this game before and I only heard good things about it, so I was really excited to start playing. It took me about 13 hours to beat it, according to GOG Galaxy. If you want the game to run in high resolutions like 2K or 4K, you'll need to download a simple file and edit the file with notepads. I didn't have any technical issues from the beginning to the very end, and the game plays smoothly in 4K with high FPS. That's always good to hear because you never know with such old games, and if you watch some of my videos about obscure RPGs, you know what I'm talking about. Speaking of old and new games actually, you can save a lot of money by buying them on Instant Gaming. Instant Gaming, the sponsor of this video, is not just another marketplace. All keys come from authorized resellers and you receive your game key instantly, as the name would suggest. This is my personal profile on Instant Gaming and I've been using it ever since 2015. I saved a lot of money over the years, especially when I was not a content creator that could afford many new games. Instant Gaming is a trustworthy site with 24/7 customer service and 4.7 score on Trustpilot. You can get keys from pretty much all major gaming platforms like PC, PlayStation, Xbox or Nintendo Switch. Whether you wanna play the current best-selling titles, an older game, or pre-order an upcoming title, Instant Gaming has it all. You can save 21% on Final Fantasy XVI, 24% on Space Marine 2, or get Black Myth Wukong with 22% discounts. All of that and thousands of more games await you on Instant Gaming, so use my link in the description to check it out and get huge discounts on your next purchase. Anyway, you play as an unnamed prince, who gets a special dagger as a gift from his father after they sacked an ancient city. They also captured an hourglass containing the mysterious Sands of Time, and they present this item as a gift from the Sultan of Azad, along with a young princess called Farah. Vizier, the main antagonist of the game, tricks the prince into releasing the Sands of Time from the hourglass, transforming the people of Azad into hideous sand monsters under his control. You spend the entire game trying to find a way to reverse this event and correct your mistake with the help of Farah, who was not affected by this curse. She was protected by her medallion, the prince was protected by the dagger, and Vizier by the staff. The dagger also gives the prince the ability to rewind the time and correct your mistakes during the gameplay. I think the story is very simple but decent. It felt a bit too cartoonish and Disney-like for my personal taste, but I didn't hate it. If I played this game back in the day when I was much younger, I will probably have at least some dose of nostalgia for the story and the game in general. But I didn't, so my opinion is as objective as possible, I guess. The story is not bad by any means, and it's more than enough to keep you interested in playing the game. There are a handful of cutscenes here and there, which were entertaining enough. I loved some of the one-liners that you can hear from the prince every once in a while.
Can't you crawl through a crack or something?
He can also be very annoying in some situations, and if I never hear the name Farah again in my life, it will be too much.
Farah, where are you? Farah? Farah? Farah, where are you?
Now let's talk about the gameplay. I really like the platforming in this game, a lot more than expected actually. I'm not a huge fan of linear platforming segments in modern action adventures, which you can beat with garage openers, or by following the infamous yellow paint like a complete moron. This game only has some subtle tips for the platforming, or nothing at all, because developers wanted you to use your brain a little bit. Imagine that. Sands of Time reminded me how good these types of games can be when developers are not treating the players as a bunch of lemurs. You know, the dumbest type of monkeys who don't even recognize the reflection. Anyway, the game quickly establishes all the rules for the platforming, and it really doesn't give a fuck for the rest of the game. You have to use your eyes. Every now and then you'll get some text on the screen for the controls, but that's about it. The game is very linear, and the margin for error is not huge, so there's no need for heavy hand-holding. You could say that the main mechanic for rewinding time is very forgiving, and maybe even on the hand-holding side of things. Despite that, the design of platforming segments is very impressive, because it feels rewarding when you progress through them. These mechanics felt instantly familiar to me, so I rarely had any problems with platforming segments, but there is a learning curve for sure. Especially when it comes to getting used to the controls, which are not very snappy in this game. I tried using a controller on the PC, but I couldn't get it to work properly, so I just continued with mouse and keyboards. Mouse and keyboard works fine, but controlling the prince felt very floaty. Turning him around feels like you're driving a car, and this usually doesn't get in the way of platforming, besides a couple of specific situations. It's more about the timing of pressing the right button rather than having quick reflexes. The core design of these mechanics is extremely well done, which certainly helps with dealing with somewhat floaty controls. I guess the most skill-based mechanic you have to do in the game is continuously jumping from wall to wall, which requires some good timing. Later in the game you'll be faced with some levels which will really test your knowledge of the core platforming mechanics as well as your reflexes. Other than that, most of these levels allow you to take your time and figure out where to go next. Some segments are on a timer, which makes those segments a bit more tense, but in a good way.
You did it! Hurry, before it closes!
Running on walls is quite possibly the most iconic mechanic from Prince of Persia. It's even on the box art of this game, and for a good reason, because this mechanic is freaking amazing. What's not so amazing is the camera, which can be your biggest enemy. It might seem like you have the full control over your camera with behind the shoulder angle, but you don't. There are many situations in the game where you can't turn the camera normally, as you would expect, because it has some weird collision issues. That's why the Sands of Time included a special camera mode, which gives you a wide overview of the surroundings. I don't know if this is because of the high resolution, but there were many situations in the game where this angle only makes things worse. It can be zoomed out way too much to be helpful, and the regular camera doesn't allow you to look up like a normal person, which can be frustrating. Nevertheless, these are just minor inconveniences rather than full-blown problems.
Fine, take all the time you need.
I don't wanna be a nitpicky bastard, but sometimes you really have to suspend your disbelief. I mean, how the hell you're able to perform some freak of nature acrobatic moves and you can't reach this freaking ladder? I mean, come on. No, you have to do a lengthy puzzle and some platforming first, which is by itself way harder compared to reaching the ladder. That doesn't matter a lot, of course, I just find it a bit funny. When it comes to puzzles, I like them a bit less than platforming segments, but they are not bad. You usually have to push some things around in order to reach something, or push some buttons which trigger some platforming segments on a timer. This certainly makes those segments a bit more intense, like I said before, because you have to restart from the beginning if you fail. Later in the game, some puzzles will require a bit more awareness of the surroundings. Sense of Time will definitely put your platforming skills to the test somewhere near the end of the game on certain levels, but I never thought the game was very hard. The combat is a different story, and it certainly magnifies some of the issues with the controls I mentioned. However, the combat system only has a handful of mechanics and enemy types, so it's pretty simple in general. That doesn't mean it's bad, but it's also not very good, to be honest. You're going to see everything that the combat has to offer in the first couple of hours of gameplay. By the end of the game, it started feeling very repetitive. That being said, the combat is perfectly functional and it has some very cool moves. Some of these mechanics will become a staple of combat in future Prince of Persia games as well. For example, being able to use the wall to perform cool jumping attacks, as well as jumping above the enemy in order to perform a special attack. Stronger enemies won't allow you to use this move unless they are staggered first, but most enemy types are weak to it. So even though the action is not great, Sense of Time has set some ground rules for the combat which the sequels will build upon. The gameplay becomes much snappier in combat because you can quickly jump from one enemy to another by simply using WASD. This is definitely the snappiest move you can do in combat and the game in general. If everything else was controlled in the same way, the gameplay in combat would be much more responsive, but it's not. You get a simple attack with the left mouse button, and you can also use the dagger to stun enemies and finish them off real quick if you have enough power. You constantly improve the power bar when you collect sand throughout the game, and there are some secret levels you can find which are not that secret, to be honest. You also get a special move which allows you to wipe out all enemies on the screen. By using all of your power, you can block attacks and use what seem to resemble a parry mechanic in a way. You have to finish enemies off when they're on the ground, and this mechanic becomes very annoying later on, even though I did like it at first. Although it kinda balances out the button mashing nature of the combat, because you can get hit while trying to execute someone. You have a limited amount of time to execute an enemy on the ground, which makes sense, but you can easily get hit in crowded fights. This single mechanic makes each and every enemy encounter a lot longer than it's supposed to be, and later on in the game you'll get to fight a ton of enemies at once, which only makes it worse. It's not annoying because it's hard, it's just not very fun, to put it simply. Speaking of not very fun, I hate these fucking birds. It's the most annoying enemy type in the game, and killing them is a huge pain in the ass. As you progress through the game, you'll upgrade your sword a couple of times, and the last sword you get has a huge damage boost, but that's about it when it comes to character progression. It's okay for an action adventure. You also increase the number of power circles you have, or whatever they're called, but this never felt that important. Enemies will attack you in waves, and I think they can be way too passive. Most of the time they just stand there and allow you to kill them in a couple of hits, but if they hit you a couple of times you can easily die. So you could say it's somewhat balanced, but it's really not that fun. Like I said, it becomes very repetitive, very fast, although the game is more focused on platforming and puzzles, that's for sure. Sense of Time only has one fixed difficulty, but the sequel will change this by offering multiple difficulty settings for better or worse. Listen, this game is actually one big advertisement for drinking water, because this is the only way to heal the prince. I know it's a bit silly, but I really like this, and the game managed to make me thirsty in real life. Yeah, don't forget to drink your water, guys, it's really important for your muscles. Just make sure not to drink it from the random pond. The last thing I want to mention is the music, which is incredible. It gives the game such amazing vibes and atmosphere, it's very good, although there are only a handful of tracks.
Now I remembered her.
I'm a huge fan of Middle Eastern music in games, or Oriental music, which is usually used in desert-like levels like this. Yeah, I know it's a bit of a meme nowadays, and this kind of music in games is westernized. It's not exactly authentic music from the Middle East, but it sounds beautiful nonetheless. Overall, I love this game, despite the issues with the combat and controls. It's an iconic game in Prince of Persia franchise, and the game that changed this IP forever. I do think that some people have a very high nostalgia dose when it comes to this game, but that's not a bad thing, we all have such feelings for some older games. I also can't wait for the remake, so you can definitely expect me to cover it when it comes out.
If you can fit under this gate, I'll really be impressed. With women, you need to show them you're in charge right from the start, or they'll walk all over you. I've been too indulgent. Probably because I felt sorry for her. Well, it stops now. From now on, she'll have to toe the line. That is, assuming I can find her.
I have more important matters to attend to.
But more will rise to take my place.
Prince of Persia: The Warrior Within came out in the late 2004 for PC and all 6th generation of consoles. It continues the story from the first game, and it's set 7 years after the happenings from Sands of Time. The prince is being haunted by a mysterious beast called the Haka, because the prince was supposed to die after releasing the sands. He learns that the sands were created on a distant island by the Empress of Time, and he decides to visit this island and change his fate once again. This game only has a handful of characters that you're going to meet. Ubisoft tried to put an interesting twist on these characters by manipulating with the time travel mechanics. Jumping from present to the past is one of the main features in this game, and you'll constantly have to switch between these two timelines, which affects the gameplay and the story. I like the story of this game a lot more than the Sands of Time. There's really not much to say about it, and it's very easy to spoil the entire story. On the other side, the plot twist, or if you can even call it like that, is pretty weak in the game, and the story is not amazing by any means. It's good enough to keep you going, which is all that matters in a game that's heavily focused on the gameplay. This time around, the story felt a bit more serious, and like I said, it has a darker vibe in general. It's not exactly a horror story or a major departure from Sands of Time, because the artistic style is obviously very similar, despite the darker tone. That being said, I don't really like the visuals in this game. The darker atmosphere certainly makes the story a bit more interesting for me, but the graphics are not very appealing, to be honest. And I'm not talking about the visual fidelity here, which is obviously pretty low by today's standards. The artistic style of Warrior Within is just very boring and flat, and the majority of levels in the game look, well, boring. It just looks way too muddy and gloomy for my personal taste, and I don't think it aged that well. Come to think of it, I like the looks of the first game a lot more when it comes to the levels and the environments. The character models, on the other hand, are much better this time around. And no, not only because of this particular scene from the intro. You perv. Yeah, believe it or not, Ubisoft used to make some pretty hot female characters. Imagine that. Too bad you have to kill this lady not long after you start the game. Important NPCs in the game have very cool visual design. Even the regular NPCs you're going to fight throughout the whole game look very cool, and once again they're all made of sand, which gives them a unique visual style. You're not even listening to me because you're still thinking about that cutscene, aren't ya? I was so happy to learn that the Warrior Within had much better gameplay in general. The controls are way more responsive and the combat is so much better. Moving the prince around doesn't feel like driving a car anymore, which instantly makes the gameplay a lot more fluid in and out of combat. You can still have some very imprecise jumps, which can be very frustrating, although this might have to do something with how I set up my controller. Yeah, I successfully managed to hook up my Xbox Series X controller and play through the entire game like this. You have to do some tweaking, and I recommend this particular controller scheme from Steam, because it works great. The prince will sometimes perform some moves that you didn't want, especially when you're near the wall, but that's about it when it comes to the bad side of the controller scheme in this game. You have 2 buttons for attacks, and some combos you can perform, which are pretty much necessary because they deal a lot more damage than regular hits. Both buttons control a different weapon. You will always have one weapon at you at all times, while the second weapon has a durability system and they easily break. This also means that you can pick up weapons from all enemies that use them. There are some very cool combos and moves that you can do by combining these 2 buttons, and you can even throw your second weapon. There will be some situations where you don't have the second weapon on you, which can make the fights a lot more frustrating, because the way that damage works in this game is kinda weird. You have some simple combos which can kill enemies in 1 or 2 hits, but when it happens that you don't have a second weapon on you, even the simplest enemy can take forever to kill, especially on the hard modes. Speaking of which, there are 3 difficulties this time around, and I started on hards. I played about 2 or 3 hours until I regretted that decision and restarted the whole game on normal. It's not because it's very hard, but it just takes forever to kill even the simplest enemy in the game, which becomes quite apparent even in the very beginning. I thought that's going to change as you progress a little bit, but it only got worse. I think this was the turning point for me when I made the switch to the normal difficulty and restarted the whole game. I assume there are particular combos you can do which will make the hard difficulty less tedious, but I felt the game will just get worse as you progress. Normal difficulty was not easy by any means, you're still going to be challenged in fights quite a bit, and the game expects you to perform combos. Like I said, the way the damage is calculated seems very weird, even on normal. I think it also depends on the main weapon you have, because you're going to find several different swords throughout the game. And if you go back to some previous levels, you can just one-shot almost all NPCs, which feels RPG-ish. Jumping from one enemy to another feels very smooth, and the same can be said about every other combat move you can perform. Blocking feels way better in this game, and as long as you press the button at the right time, you can block even the fastest enemy attacks. The majority of boss fights even require you to block a lot of attacks before you can retaliate with your attacks. Then again, you won't fight a lot of bosses in this game, and a couple of them are almost identical fights, with 1 or 2 extra mechanic. There are some pure bullshit moves that these bosses can perform to catch you off guard, which don't feel fair because you can't even react. But blocking works great, and you can even perform a counter attack if your timing is right, which feels very good. Warrior Within introduces more enemy types in the first couple of hours than Sense of Time in the whole game. This was really refreshing, especially because I came directly from Sense of Time into this game, where you fight a couple of the same enemy types all the time. I mean, it's not like you're not going to do that in this game as well, but Warrior Within has a very decent amount of different enemy types. Enemies are much more aggressive in general, but the game encourages you to be aggressive as well. Like I said, you pretty much have to perform at least some simple button combinations in order to take out these enemies as fast as possible. Even though the enemy variety is pretty decent in this game, I think they overuse some elite fights, which are not so fun. This big guy is interesting when you get to fight him the first time, but the game insists on fighting him the second time, right after you already killed him. And then again, and again, and again, he just gets a different skin. The fight itself is okay, but it's basically a QTE in disguise. You have to move to the right side at the right time and stab him in the head, that's pretty much it. And do some damage to his feet before that. It works okay, but it's not that fun fighting him over and over again. The worst thing about this fight is when the game decides to cheat and kill you when you can't even react, which happened like 10 times in this particular level. You have to pray that he doesn't decide to use that stupid attack in the beginning. Not to mention that he can also throw you straight to your death from his back, which feels very cheap. Luckily, the game gives you some special abilities to use which can mitigate a lot of these issues. You can slow down the time like in the first game, roll back the time, and perform some crazy looking but not so useful attacks. Just like in the first game, you can collect and expand your sand tanks, which is the resource you use for special abilities. You're constantly going to improve one special ability, which is supposed to be used for fighting a lot of enemies at once, but to be honest, I never found it that useful. You can literally kill these enemies a lot faster with regular combos than using this flashy ability. It looks very cool, but it's kinda useless, and you end up wasting your sand tanks, which can be used to roll back the time when you mess something up. Overall, the combat in this game remains interesting to the very end, because the game introduces good amount of different enemy types to fight. I mean, sure, some of them are just reskins or invisible enemy that you fought before, but still, it's well done. When I started to play this game, I certainly didn't expect to experience so many issues with the level design. It turns out that I enjoyed the level design of the first game a lot more. Sands of Time almost had no backtracking at all and no major issues when it comes to the level design. Unfortunately, that can't be said about The Warrior Within. This game took a bit more different approach to the level design and how you progress through the levels. On one side, the game feels more realistic than its predecessor because you get this big castle to explore and its surroundings. So it makes sense that you're going to go back and forth through these levels. It feels like an actual place, and it's not so linear like the first game. But that doesn't mean it's more fun by default. Quite the opposite actually, it makes the game very tedious, especially because you still have to do some old platforming that you already did before. It's fun to experience the same place in the present and the past, when you get to switch these timelines, but it's only fun for the first time. The platforming segments are slightly different in the present and the past, but they're interesting and different enough to be enjoyable. However, knowing where you need to go next can be extremely confusing, and not to mention that you can take the wrong turn and end up running in circles. To make things even worse, the game respawns all enemies in previous zones. You can skip a lot of these enemies, but can still be frustrating. The map is totally useless in this game, by the way. It only vaguely shows you where to go and what to do, which I would usually prefer. But the map is not the issue here, it's the different approach to the level design, which can easily confuse the player at some points in the game. You can even say that The Warrior Within has some open world aspects to its design, which should be right up my alley. But having to repeat the same platforming segments over and over again is boring as all hell. If they somehow manage to turn off the traps and everything that keeps you from progressing through the levels that you already beat, it would make the backtracking a bit less tedious. The game does that for some levels, but definitely not all of them. The platforming itself is very good actually, even much better than Sands of Time. By the end of the game, you'll be performing some challenging jumps which felt rewarding when you pulled them off. Avoiding traps, pushing, pulling and turning things around, running on walls, etc, all of that feels great in the game. But these glaring issues with the level design definitely made my experience with the game worse. It just feels like the game is wasting your time sometimes. Warrior Within tries to spice up the platforming segments with a mysterious sand creature called the Haka, which chases you every now and then. It starts off very simple, but these chase scenes become progressively harder, although I never found them very hard. It's a nice little addition to the gameplay, which adds a bit of urgency to platforming. It's essentially similar to timed platforming segments from the first game, with a huge scary monster on top of it. It seems like Ubisoft took some pages from Capcom's Resident Evil 3, where you're being chased by Immortal Monster. Maybe, I don't know, but I like this new feature because it usually breaks the monotony a little bit. I also like how they added some enemies you have to deal with in the middle of the platforming segments. The checkpoint system in this game can be very bad at times. You can progress quite a bit, and if you die at a certain place, you can lose a lot of progress. You can save the game manually at these little fountains, and sometimes you'll find a couple of them very close, while others can be very far away from each other. Their placement could have been a lot better in general. Overall, The Warrior Within improved a lot of the core features from the first game, which makes the gameplay a lot more enjoyable. The different approach to the level design has its interesting moments when you manipulate with the present and the past, and the platforming is better than ever. However, I think the problems with the level design makes the game less enjoyable in general. It's still a great game despite those issues, but I can't decide if it's better than Sands of Time when it's all said and done. Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones came out in 2005 for PC and consoles, and this was the first Prince of Persia game that I played back in the day. I had plans for years to replay this game again and talk about it on the channel, but I wanted to wait for the perfect opportunity. It's been more than 10 years since I last played this game, and I did remember some things like the level design and little parts about the gameplay, but that's about it. I'm glad I played the previous games before I started the Two Thrones again, because they give you some great context about the story and the gameplay as well. I was really wondering if the Two Thrones is as good as I remember, and I'm glad to say that this wasn't just nostalgia speaking. Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones is easily the best game in the original trilogy. It takes everything which made the first two games so great, but it also has some brand new features. First of all, I think the Two Thrones looks and feels more like the first game in the trilogy for a couple of reasons. The narration for the menu is back from the first game, but this time around the game is narrated by Kalina, the Empress of Time from the second game.
I am happy to wait. I have all the time in the world.
I'm glad to say that the Two Thrones doesn't have any issues with the level design like the second game. As a matter of fact, the game has almost no issues at all, and it's hard to complain about anything. Let's take it back and start from the very beginning. Just like the first two games, you'll have to do some manual tweaks if you want to completely optimize the game on modern PCs. This patch will fix most issues you might have and give you the option to choose modern resolutions like Full HD, 2K or 4K. It also fixes and drastically improves the camera angles in the game. It's a massive difference, so you should install it by any means. I played the game with a controller and I tried around 3 different Steam profiles. I found this one to work the best because other controller profiles had issues with double inputs, which made your camera move every time you do a wall run. It was beyond annoying. The unofficial patch also improves the visuals of the game. The colors are very vibrant and the lighting looks way better as well. Speaking of visuals, I like how the Two Thrones look, and I think the game aged great, despite a lot of low-res textures you can see pretty much everywhere. But the overall vibe and atmosphere of the game is immaculate. The prince looks very cool in both of his forms, and we have Farah back from the first game that also got a facelift.
Are you mad?
Farah? Farah, where are you?
This game tried to be very ambitious with the distant terrain on some levels, but it just looks silly and pre-rendered. Other than that, I just can't get enough of the visuals and vibes of this game. It's usually very bright, but there are some darker levels like this one for example, which switches up the mood of the game quite a bit. Or how about this great looking palace level? It's very impressive how they managed to have such a strong visual variety when it comes to the environments, especially compared to the first two games, where most areas look same-ish. The visual design of Vizier, the main antagonist of the game, is very bizarre and not that good to be honest, but pretty much all other characters' designs are very cool. The story about the prince continues in the Two Thrones, where he returns home to Babylon along with the Empress of Time, Kalina. If that's a bit confusing because you get to kill her in the last game, well, that's because Ubisoft took only one of the endings as canon. I mean, of course they're not going to kill the hot lady, who the fuck cares about your choices in the game anyway? Prince finds out that everything he did in the Sands of Time had been undone by his actions in the last game. Vizier is back, and he uses this chance to absorb the Empress of Time, which grants him godly powers, basically. Shortly after this, you get to meet Farah again.
Farah?
But she obviously doesn't remember you. To be honest, this story started to get a little bit stale, because it follows the same rules set from previous two games. Not to mention that some parts of it were predictable and even a bit unfinished, like your inner voice that talks with you from time to time.
If it comforts you to mock me, then by all means continue.
Farah, where are you?
That being said, I think the dialogue was well written and it has a little bit of humor every now and then.
What is your favorite color?
Color?
Shall I repeat the question?
Blue.
Blue? That's not my favorite color.
What is the point of this?
The prince and Farah have interesting banter, but it's not an amazing story to be honest. Like I said before, it's more than enough to justify the gameplay, which is what matters the most in these games.
Would it kill you to show a little optimism?
Overall, it's a pretty decent ending to the story of this trilogy. The gameplay in the Two Thrones is very good, and I would say it's amazing from time to time. Just like the warrior within, controlling the prince feels very smooth and responsive, and it's not that different when it comes to the fundamental mechanics. However, we have some brand new features in combat, as well as the platforming segments. You still have the same combo system from previous games, where you can equip 2 different weapons. The moveset is almost identical because if it works, don't try to fix it, I guess. I think the durability system for weapons in this game is a little bit more forgiving, but your second weapon still breaks on regular basis. Although in this game, I felt like getting a second weapon felt a bit easier in general. The combos feel the same, but the game introduces a brand new feature on top of this combat system which can completely change the way you play the game. That will be the stealth system, which allows you to execute one or even multiple enemies at once with a good timing of your hits. I found this to be a very decent stealth/assassination system, although sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense. NPCs can either act like Skyrim AI or they can see through walls. They're supposed to react to the noise you make, but whatever. The stealth system is a great new addition to this combat system. It's not that easy to perform perfect assassinations, and you really need to be focused on the animation and the sound effects. Even when you manage to kill one NPC, you can easily be seen by another, which forces you into actual combat system. And you have unique kill moves for both forms. The bottom line is, it feels very rewarding when you pull it off flawlessly, especially on stronger NPCs, which require you to hit them more than a couple of times before they die. The Two Thrones also has different difficulty settings, and I'm glad to say that I love the hard difficulty in this game. It feels way more balanced than in the last game, and it's not tedious at all. The damage is still a bit weird like in the last game, but you won't have to spend eternity to kill regular enemies on hards. Especially if you are very successful with the new stealth mechanics. Ubisoft tried to implement the same assassination mechanics in boss fights, but they're essentially just quick time events. However, I think boss fights in this game are pretty decent in general. Don't expect to fight a ton of them, there are only a handful of bosses in general, but they all have a decent amount of mechanics, which are like little puzzles you have to figure out. The second big feature when it comes to combat and the gameplay in general is the Dark Prince form. The game will automatically switch to this dark form at certain levels, and it changes the combat and the platforming segments. Your health will slowly deplete, and you have to replenish your sand tank by killing enemies or breaking objects, which heals you. I found the timing aspect of this form a little bit annoying, but it's manageable. I would prefer not to have a timing on this form at all, because you will switch to the regular prince every time you hit the water anyway, which is obviously very scripted. The time limiting factor feels unnecessary, but like I said, it's manageable and it gives the platforming segments a sense of urgency. The combat is even smoother in this form, although it's a little bit OP. I never found myself in very dangerous situations in combat in this form because it's very easy to perform combos and destroy enemies. There is a reason why you never fight a boss in this form, which goes to show you how powerful it is. Although to be fair, the damage you deal doesn't matter that much in boss fights, but anyway. You get this very cool chain, which you can use in more than a couple of ways. It's seamlessly implemented in the combo system, which feels very similar, if not identical to the last game. The Two Thrones has a decent amount of enemy types, but fighting them in this form feels a bit more repetitive than usual. Elite NPCs will take way more hits, but you can kill anyone with a few well-timed combos. You can easily get interrupted while performing a combo, but the combat feels fair in general. Parrying attacks works even better now, and you need to block some of the attacks here and there, but for the most part you can be very aggressive in both forms. I really don't need to repeat myself when it comes to combos and combat, because like I said, it pretty much works the same like in the last game. You can slow down and rewind the time and use a powerful ability when you have enough sand tanks. NPCs also have some new tricks in their sleeve. They can call for reinforcements if you don't kill the elite NPC in time, and like I said before, they can react to the noise you make, which ruins your opportunity to take them down with stealth mechanics. This game also introduces some chase scenes where you have to ride horses and try not to smash into something. NPCs will try to take you out, and you have some basic attacks to take them down or push them off the roads. I think this is well done in general, and it's one of those features which serve to break the monotony of regular gameplay. When it comes to the platforming segments and the level design, I think they are the best in the trilogy. The two Thrones decided to make the level design in this game a lot more similar to the Sands of Time rather than the Warrior Within. The more linear design is back and there are no backtracking this time around. However, the two Thrones introduced a couple of brand new mechanics which keep the platforming segments fresh. Now you can bounce from walls, hang with your dagger on a certain spot on the wall, and use narrow walls to slide up or down. The game combines these new mechanics along with the old ones to create some very satisfying platforming segments and puzzle solving. Some of the puzzles are a bit annoying like this one, but for the most part it was very good. Combined with the new combat mechanics, the two Thrones manages to bring this gameplay formula to its fullest potential. It also doesn't overstay its welcome. I needed around 10 hours to fully complete it. Overall, The Two Thrones is definitely the best game in the original trilogy, if you ask me.
What is wrong with you?
They are messy, impossible to eat with dignity. So much work for a few seeds.
But is it not the effort that makes them that much sweeter?
That was scary.
Prince of Persia came out in 2008 for PC and consoles. Yeah, this game is only called Prince of Persia and is the most inappropriate name for this particular game because it has very little to do with the original trilogy.
I'm not in a good mood.
But to be fair, Ubisoft's original trilogy is not exactly like the original Prince of Persia games, so take that as you will. First of all, I gotta say that I respect the decision to try something new and step away from the old formula. I didn't have a clue what to expect from this game, but I knew that it's not exactly the Prince of Persia that I remember. It has a completely different cartoony artistic style, which is quite possibly the best aspect of this game. It still looks great in 2024, and it's another example why such heavily stylized art style always ages a lot better than realistic graphics. You play the game as a nameless adventurer in search of fortune, and you're joined by a companion named Elika, who is essentially your guide.
Hi.
The game starts with the prince trying to find Farah and he's yelling her name, only to realize that Farah is actually his donkey. Yeah, the writing in this game only gets even worse from here, unfortunately.
I heard you yelling. You and your girlfriend should get out of here.
Girlfriend? Farah's not my girlfriend, she's my donkey.
Listen, Prince of Persia games never had an amazing writing and dialogue, but it was okay, and it has some entertaining moments.
If it comforts you to mock me, then by all means continue.
But this is the first Prince of Persia game which made me cringe with the dialogue. It's pretty bad overall.
You guys worship a tree?
We need to reach him, to stop him.
Hey, step away from there. If I ever find that donkey. Carpet's this thick. This thick! Say, the next time you want to win your daughter back, you could try just giving her a pony. The apocalypse doesn't really cut it.
If you don't dream, you will never be more than you are.
And if you don't wake up, dreaming's all you'll ever do.
Are you retarded?
So I quickly lost the interest for the story and what's going on in general. In short, you're supposed to heal some designated places on the map with Elika and collect enough blobs to unlock more powers for the prince. This game also features a more open world exploration and you have some freedom to choose the next location you explore, but it's really not a big deal. Once you get to those locations, the level design is very linear, like in most Prince of Persia games. And not in a good way, it's much worse compared to older games. I mean, it's not bad in general, and this game had some nice little details when it comes to platforming, which look cool, but that's about it. The gameplay is much different, and even some of the fundamental Prince of Persia mechanics that you come to expect from these games don't feel nearly as good as in older games. The controls feel kinda floaty, especially compared to the Two Thrones. It's not awful or anything, and it takes a while to get used to, it works okay. The platforming itself is quite possibly the worst in the series, and you just go through the motion most of the time. But that's not even the worst part about this game. The platforming would be just enough if this game didn't have such awful combat and some very weird design decisions. This game doesn't have any simple NPCs and enemies, which would be fine if the combat itself wasn't so bad. It feels very static and it's not rewarding at all. You get a handful of attacks and moves, and only one of them remotely resembles a combat move from previous games, which would be the jumping attack. It looks cool, and for the first couple of fights you can have some fun with the combat system. But it's just way too stiff and static, and even though the fights are few and far between, I never look forward to fight NPCs in this game. Here comes the elephant in the room. You can't even die in this game, no matter how bad you play. That goes for the combat and the platforming segments. Elika will always catch you if you fall, or save you from the attack that was supposed to kill you. Now, I can see how you can try to defend the platforming segments because it's very similar to reloading the game at the last checkpoint anyway, it's just faster. However, I think having such design decisions in combat is just terrible. It takes away from the thrill of the combat if you know that no matter what you do, you still can't fail. I can't even comprehend who thought that this was a good idea, and that person needs to take a good look at the mirror.
Would it kill you to show a little optimism?
All jokes aside, I really didn't like this game and I couldn't drag myself to finish it. After about 4 hours of gameplay, the only thing I could think about is the next game in the series. Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sands came out in 2010 for PC and consoles. Just like with the previous game, I had no idea what to expect here. I did saw some mediocre reviews for this game, and it still has mixed reviews on Steam, so I didn't expect much. I was really curious to learn why people didn't like this game that much. Well, after finishing the game in a couple of sittings, I can definitely see why some people didn't like it. However, and this might be a hot take, I think this game is very decent.
Are you mad?
Not as good as the original trilogy, but astronomically better than the last game and just good in general, to be honest. It tries to bring back the old vibes of Prince of Persia with the visuals and some recognizable gameplay mechanics. But it also has a new approach to the gameplay, especially for the platforming segments. This is basically a hack and slash Prince of Persia game, and I'm willing to bet that's the main reason why a lot of people didn't like it. You're going to fight a ton of enemies at once, and even though I was really skeptical at first, I ended up liking the combat as well, even though it's a little bit mindless at times. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, so let's start from the beginning. Once again, you play as a nameless prince, a son of the Persian king Shahraman. The Forgotten Sands is set in between the Sands of Time and the Warrior Within, and is supposed to fill the 7-year gap between the two games. The prince is sent by his father to learn the leadership skills from his brother Malik, but he finds the city under siege. In an attempt to draw the invaders back, Malik released Solomon's army, a powerful supernatural force which was trapped within the palace. Naturally, the army turns on everyone, and Malik and the prince get separated. They are both in the possession of the seal, which released the army, and if they manage to merge them together again, the army is supposed to be locked away. As you could probably guess, it won't be that simple.
That's helpful!
Malik learns that he gets more powerful as he kills more sand monsters, so he becomes corrupted with power and eventually consumed by Ratash, the main antagonist of the game. By the way, Ratash has a very cool visual design, it's like Diablo but much taller, I guess. The prince will also meet Razia, a djinn, or a goddess if you will, who serves the prince as a guide and grants him special powers. I think the story of the game was decent, and it keeps your attention from the beginning to the very end. The Forgotten Sands is a very short game, and it took me about 6 hours to fully complete it in just a couple of sittings. There are no crazy plot twists or any plot twist at all for that matter, but I was still curious about what's going to happen, even though it was very predictable. Putting the story aside, I think this game looks very good. It gives me strong sense of time vibes with the art style, but with a much higher fidelity of course. All three main characters look pretty good, and like I said before, the main antagonist looks cool, if not a bit generic, but whatever. I don't think anything can beat the Dark Prince looks from the Two Thrones when it comes to the cool factor. The levels don't have a crazy amount of visual variety, but that doesn't mean they look bad. It looks very good from time to time on some levels, and just decent or even a bit generic on some other levels. Overall, I think this game was semi-successful with bringing the old Prince of Persia look back. So what about the gameplay? Well, I'm glad you asked. You little bitch.
That's helpful!
My first interaction with the gameplay wasn't that positive and I expected to only get worse for some reason. But luckily, I was wrong. It takes a while to get used to the control scheme, and the prince is not exactly moving the same way like in old games, even though there is a lot of resemblance. The animations for some of these old school moves are a bit different, but it's enough to throw you off guard the first time you try them out. For example, the jumps have a higher range than before in some situations. That being said, this game has some new and very cool ideas for the platforming segments, and I wish some of them were present in the old games as well. For example, you can quickly jump from one pillar to another by just pushing the thumbstick in your desired direction. It makes going through these segments very enjoyable. The prince is also moving a lot faster while platforming, which makes the gameplay very fluid, even though you lose a little bit of that old school feeling when you're doing platforming segments. You gain the ability to freeze water in this game and materialize some objects. The game really surprised me how well they managed to implement these new features on top of the old school design of Prince of Persia. Like I said, I went into this game expecting to be disappointed, but this only made me like the game a lot more. The platforming segments where you need to freeze the water are great, and the game will test your skills quite a bit by having to release and freeze the water in the middle of the jump. Same goes with materializing the environment around you, which adds another layer of depth to the platforming segments. Some old platforming features from the original trilogy are back, and I feel they're a bit overused, especially when it comes to turning things around. I mean, yeah, this was one of the major features in old games, but it feels way overdone in this game, and some of these puzzles were not that fun. They felt a bit forced, to be honest, which can also be said for some of the platforming segments. Now when I think about it, the regular platforming and traps are not nearly as good as in older games, they felt very basic. It's clear that the most effort went into these brand new platforming features, which was a good decision because they're awesome. As you would expect, you can rewind the time like in previous games, and healing is done exclusively through breaking pots on the map. You can't drink water anymore to heal, which is kinda ironic because, like I said, there is a bunch of water in this game. This could have been a problem if the game had a very hard difficulty, but it doesn't, so it's not a big deal. Speaking of difficulty, let's talk about the combat system. The combat is once again completely different, but unlike the last game from 2008, it works a lot better and it makes a lot more sense. Listen, I love the combat in the Two Thrones, but it was essentially the same game like Warrior Within, with a couple of brand new features on top of it. The combo system really started to get stale, and they needed to try something new. 2008 game completely failed when it comes to combat, but this game does a decent job with the new hack and slash mechanics. You only get one weapon in this game, and the prince can perform fast and strong attacks, which has huge AoE effects. You can hit up to 5 different enemies at once, and I like the feel of the combat in general. It flows nicely, and you can still perform combos at the end of the attack. You can also combine strong and fast attacks in the combo. It's a shame there is no hard difficulty because I found the normal really easy. Regular enemies are really easy to kill, while some NPCs require you to kick their shield before you can deal some damage to them. Enemies have telegraphed and very slow attacks which you can easily anticipate, but this is another game where being very aggressive pays off. The strong attack is very satisfying, so I ended up using it a lot, not to mention that it deals a lot more damage. This time around we got a skill tree for the prince where you can get some powers to use in combat, like leaving the trail of fire or a defensive skill that protects you. You can unlock a couple of more powers that have AoE effect, which can be very useful when you're surrounded, which happens frequently in this game. And of course, you can also get some passive skills which improve your core stats and abilities. Killing enemies gives you XP, which you can invest into the skill tree. Boss fights are few and far between, but I did like them in general. They have a handful of mechanics that you have to worry about, but it's nothing crazy. Maybe I shouldn't even say boss fights, because there are only like 2, but the main one has many different stages which the game drags on to the very end. It feels a bit cheap, especially because the game itself is very short, and I guess that would be one of the main problems with the game. If it had at least a couple of more unique boss fights, this would be an amazing action adventure. Like I said before, the combat can feel mindless and very easy, but this was easily fixable with another difficulty. I can see this combat system getting really repetitive if the game was much longer. Overall, I really like this game, and it will only take a couple of sittings to finish it, so I definitely recommend it. It's a very decent action adventure for what it's trying to do. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown came out in January 2024 for PC and current-gen consoles. I tried this game out on PS5 when it first released, and I only played around 3 hours. Not because I didn't like it, I just had to move on with some other projects I was doing back then. But I remember that I really liked the game in general, I was just waiting for a strong reason to go back to it and finish it. This game is obviously more like the old school Prince of Persia side-scrollers, which is way different compared to the third-person action-adventure games we got up to 2010. I obviously didn't cover older Prince of Persia games in this video, but I might do it in the future. Anyway, The Lost Crown is actually an amazing game in general, and there is very little to complain about. This game has a great artistic style and even better presentation. I was amazed with some levels that have crazy things going on in the background, it's very cool. The same can be said about enemy designs, especially when it comes to bosses. The way the dialogue is presented reminds me a lot of Hades, but this game also has in-engine cutscenes every now and then. You play as Sargon, a young member of a warrior clan named the Immortals. Each member of Immortals is a very powerful warrior. The Immortals get a mission to rescue the Prince Ghassan, who was kidnapped in the beginning of the game. You then travel to the Cursed City, where the time works different for everyone you meet. Yeah, the trademark time mechanics are back, but this time around they are being used by the game's antagonist, which is an interesting spin on the story. I enjoy the story and dialogue in general, and it's really easy to spoil it, so I have to keep my mouth shut. You won't have to play a lot to get to the first plot twist. It was not extremely impactful, but it was okay, just like the story in general. The Lost Crown has a lot of Metroidvania elements. The map has secrets and shortcuts to find, you can go back and forth or up or down, which takes you to different areas. It's not a linear experience, even though it might seem like that to people who don't play these kinds of games anymore. I enjoyed exploring these areas a lot, and you can choose if you want a more guided exploration or less hand-holding. Like I said, it's not exactly completely linear, and you can find side quests to do, which usually reward you with something useful. As for the gameplay itself, it's very smooth and enjoyable. The controls are snappy, which makes the platforming and combat very enjoyable. I was actually surprised how good the gameplay feels in this game, and I don't know why I expected a much worse experience. Once you start playing, it's very hard to put the controller down. Sargon is dual-wielding swords, and he also gets a bow after you do the required quests. You have a simple combo system with swords by repeatedly pressing the button, or you can hold it for a strong attack. There are some special powers you can use when this bar gets filled, and you get more of these special powers as you defeat bosses. These abilities are very flashy and anime-like even, they stop the time and they feel very powerful in general, but you can also miss them if your timing sucks. Parrying attacks fills up the special bar, and this skill-based move is freaking awesome. It helps you kill weaker enemies a lot easier, and it deals some massive damage to bosses when you pull it off. The combat is really skill based in general, which some people might not like, but I freaking love it. Listen, this game can be hard as nails on harder difficulties. I played on the second hardest difficulty and I got my ass handed to me a lot, especially in the beginning. You can get killed pretty fast if you let your guard down, even by the most simple enemy type. I still didn't finish the game, so I didn't fight all the bosses, but those that I killed so far are great fights. They have a very decent amount of challenge and they feel fair, which is quite important. You can get different talismans and equip them on Sargon, which can give you different gameplay benefits. Sargon has very fluid movement, which makes going through the platforming segments very enjoyable, but the platforming itself is just okay. It's not bad by any means, I was just not impressed by it, I guess. I like the level design a lot more, and the fact that you have to come back to some places once you get what you need. Overall, this is a very enjoyable and addictive game with amazing skill-based gameplay. The Rogue Prince of Persia came out in early access in May 2024. Not so long after The Lost Crown, which was very surprising actually. It's another side-scroller that resembles older Prince of Persia games, but it's in early access, so it's obviously not complete. I was not sure if I'm going to cover it because of that, but I did get to play it a little bit, so why not include it? I have mixed feelings about this one. The visuals in this game just didn't click with me. It's clear that they tried to pull off a unique cartoony art style, but it just looks bland and devoid of detail. Now of course, this can be highly subjective, you might love this art style, but I certainly didn't. So what about the story and the gameplay? Well, you play as another prince, but he doesn't have anything to do with the old prince from Prince of Persia games. The prince provokes the Han army, and their chief Nogai sends an army of possessed soldiers to destroy the city. You will meet a couple of characters and the dialogue is similar like in the last game, but the Rogue doesn't have any voice acting, at least for now. I'm not sure if that's going to change. Now let's talk about what truly matters, which will be the gameplay. As the name would suggest, the Rogue has roguelike mechanics, which are very famous nowadays, I guess. I'm not exactly a fan of roguelike games in general, but I like playing some of them every once in a while. You know what to expect from games like this upon death. You restart, but you can also keep some of the progression. The gameplay itself has some cool ideas, and it also brings back some trademark mechanics that The Lost Crown lacked. For example, the wall running ability is back and it's very important for platforming once again, and you can also vault over enemies. You can get different weapons as you play, which felt refreshing coming from The Lost Crown, which forces you to play with only one melee weapon. Controlling the prince is responsive, but not as responsive as in The Lost Crown. If you come straight from The Lost Crown into this game, you'll probably get a bit disappointed because that game does everything better. That doesn't mean the Rogue is a bad game, and the gameplay can be really fun in general. But I had a hard time adjusting to the controls of this game after The Lost Crown. It felt a bit clunky to me at first, but it takes a while to get used to, I guess. Even so, I still think the controls are a bit on the stiff side in general. The combat is fine, and the same can be said about the platforming segments. I like how you can find these slightly hidden rooms, which can reward you with gold if you manage to complete the platforming segments. Another currency you collect is used for forging different weapons at the blacksmiths. I like the feel of the slower weapons in the game, like the big two-handed sword. There is also a skill tree with passive abilities. As for the bosses, I only fought this one so far, and to be honest, I didn't like it that much. I really can't shake the feeling that the last game does everything better and the roguelike mechanics in this game are not doing anything for me. Maybe that's a bit too harsh, because this game is decent in general if you don't compare it to the last one in the series, so you be the judge. I might give it another chance when the full game releases. And that would cover all Ubisoft's Prince of Persia games.
Can't you crawl through a crack or something?
I had a ton of fun playing these games in the last months. The Two Thrones is certainly my most favorite Prince of Persia game ever.
So much work for a few seeds.
I also enjoyed playing the original trilogy a lot, as well as the Forgotten Sands. But The Lost Crown is certainly the best Prince of Persia game ever since The Two Thrones. The one from 2008 is almost not even worth mentioning.
You guys worship a tree?
And the Rogue still has the time to prove itself when we get the full release. Anyway, tell me your opinion about Prince of Persia games and which one is your favorite. Leave a comment down below. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed the video. You can also support me by becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon. I also have some cool t-shirts and hoodies in the theme of the channel, so check that out as well. Huge thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.